Picture this: Angola 1975. After centuries of Portuguese rule, the country is finally on the verge of independence. But instead of celebration, there's chaos. Three rival factions, the MPLA, UNITA, and FNLA, are scrambling to seize control of the capital, Luanda. Whoever takes it first won't just claim the city, they'll become the internationally recognized government of Angola. This wasn't just an internal struggle. The Cold War turned Angola into a proxy battleground, with the Soviet Union, Cuba, the US, and South Africa all throwing their weight behind different factions. So, how did the MPLA emerge victorious? Let's break it down. Angola had been a Portuguese colony for nearly 400 years, exploited for its land, labor, and resources. But by the 1960s, independence movements across Africa were gaining momentum. In Angola, three major groups rose to challenge Portuguese rule. The MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, a Marxist-Leninist movement backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba, supported mainly by the Mbundu people and dominant in Angola's cities. UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, led by Jonas Savimbi, backed by the United States and South Africa, supported mainly by the Mbundu people and dominant in Angola's southern regions. The FNLA, National Front for the Liberation of Angola, led by Holden Roberto, backed by Mobutu's Zaire and the United States with its base of support in Angola's north. While all three groups opposed colonial rule, they were bitter rivals. Each side was determined to be in control of Angola once the Liberation War was over. The fight against Portugal was brutal, but even as the war raged on, it became clear that the real battle wouldn't be against the Portuguese, it would be against each other. By the early 1970s, Portugal was struggling. The costly colonial wars, including the one in Angola, were draining its economy and morale. Then, on April 25, 1974, the unthinkable happened. A peaceful coup in Lisbon, known as the Carnation Revolution, overthrew Portugal's dictatorship. The new Portuguese leadership had no interest in holding on to its African colonies. They made it clear that they intended to grant independence to all Portuguese colonies, including Angola. But there was no clear plan for a transition, and Portuguese troops in Angola quickly lost interest in policing the country. This created a massive power vacuum, and the three Angolan factions raced to fill it. Throughout 1974, each side focused on grabbing as much territory as it could. Everyone knew that a bloodbath was coming. It was better to prepare for it now. In January 1975, the three factions met with Portuguese officials and signed the Alvo Agreement, which laid out a plan for a transitional government with shared power. This government would be made up of representatives from each faction and would govern Angola until the 11th of November 1975, when Portugal would formally grant Angola its independence. But almost immediately, it became clear that no one intended to honor it. Each faction used the ceasefire as an opportunity to stockpile weapons and expand their territories. The MPLA strengthened its grip on Luanda, the FNLA tried to push south, and UNITA maneuvered in the central and southern regions. By mid-1975, open fighting had resumed, and the transitional government was all but dead. The fight for Luanda was officially on. Angola's internal conflict became a global chess match as the Cold War superpowers picked sides. Cuba and the Soviet Union supported the MPLA. The Soviet provided weapons, financial assistance, and military advisors, while Cuba sent thousands of troops who would be crucial in the fighting that followed. The United States, South Africa, Zaire, and China supported the FNLA. China provided training to the FNLA's armed wing, largely because it wanted to counterbalance the Soviet Union's influence in Africa. Zaire's Mobutu had personal ties to FNLA leader Holden Roberto and sent Zairean troops and weapons to support him. The United States secretly backed the FNLA as it wanted to prevent the Soviet Union from getting another client state in Africa. It mostly sent weapons and money to the FNLA via the CIA. Apartheid South Africa sent weapons and military advisors to the FNLA. The South Africans did not want to see a communist government in Angola, as they were sure it would support the ANC and SWAPO, liberation movements it was at war with. The United States and South Africa also supported UNITA. The South Africans provided weapons, training, and finances to UNITA. As the war dragged on, they would also send their troops to fight alongside UNITA. Their aim was to prevent an MPLA-ruled Angola, which they were sure would give sanctuary to ANC and SWAPO fighters. The United States largely gave piecemeal aid to UNITA. They were keen on preventing the Soviets from gaining influence in Angola. With the international players fueling the fire, the fight for Luanda wasn't just about Angola anymore. It was also a Cold War battleground. It was now a fight for influence by some of the world's most powerful countries. The fighting between the FNLA and the MPLA erupted roughly around late January 1975 and early February 1975. Most of the fighting was concentrated in the capital, Luanda. UNITA, weaker than the other two sides, pulled out from Luanda and retreated to its southern homelands instead. For the next couple of months, fighting between the MPLA and the FNLA raged across much of northern Angola and within Luanda and its outskirts. The FNLA got the upper hand in the north of the country, where it firmly consolidated its control. However, by June 1975, the MPLA's forces had managed to push the FNLA out of the capital. While the MPLA now had full control of Luanda, its position was far from secure. Holt and Roberto's forces were only a few dozen kilometers away. It was only a matter of time before they regrouped and mounted another assault on the capital. This they did on the 10th of November 1975, right on the eve of Angola's independence. Backed by hundreds of Zairean paratroopers, a South African artillery detachment, South African military advisors, and lavishly equipped with CIA weapons, Holt and Roberto's FNLA marched on Luanda intent on taking it before Independence Day. Their forces reached Kwefangondo, the last major obstacle before the capital. If they could break through, they would take Luanda before Independence Day. But the MPLA's defenders at Kwefangondo were ready. With Cuban military advisors, Soviet Grad launchers, thousands of loyal fighters, and well-prepared defenses, they were sure they would beat back the FNLA's attack. On the morning of November 10, 1975, just one day before Angola's independence, the two sides clashed during the Battle of Kwefangondo. By the end of that day, the FNLA had been badly defeated. It had lost huge numbers of its fighters and weapons. The MPLA had successfully defended its hold on power. The very next day, November 11, 1975, the MPLA declared Angola's independence. More than 30 countries immediately recognized it as Angola's rightful government. After the triumph at Kwefangondo, the MPLA pursued what was left of Holt and Roberto's FNLA. A series of crushing defeats over the next few months effectively destroyed the FNLA. Holt and Roberto went into exile, and the few remaining fighters in the FNLA fled across the Zaire border or simply defected. By March 1976, the FNLA was all but dead. In the south of Angola, Jonas Savimbi and his UNITA watched on as the MPLA and FNLA went at each other's throats. They busied themselves with consolidating control over as much of the south as they possibly could. Weaker than the other two factions, UNITA chose to be neutral. Jonas Savimbi, its leader, focused instead on recruiting new fighters for his army and actively seeking support from any external power he could find. He understood that this was simply the calm before the storm, and he was right. Having pushed the FNLA out of Luanda, the MPLA, backed by Cuban advisors and Soviet arms, pushed south, clashing with UNITA troops at Luanda in August 1975. Realizing just how hopelessly outmatched he was, Jonas Savimbi abandoned his neutrality and formed an alliance with the FNLA. He also stepped up his efforts to find a new external power for his seriously outmatched UNITA. The apartheid government was more than willing to help. Alarmed by intelligence reports which predicted an MPLA victory, the apartheid government came to UNITA's rescue. The South Africans shipped arms to UNITA, offered logistical support, and also started training UNITA's fighters. But by October 1975, it was clear that this wasn't enough. UNITA was still losing ground. Egged on secretly by the Americans, the South Africans launched Operation Savannah and intervened directly on 14 October 1975. Two task forces of South African troops, Zulu and Foxbat, surged over the Namibian border and advanced deep into Angola. The South Africans quickly turned the tide back into UNITA's favor. They quickly took several key towns such as Huambo, Benguela, Onjiva, and Shangongo, handing over control of these towns to their UNITA allies. By early November 1975, they were within 240 kilometers of Luanda. Alarmed by the rapid advance of the South Africans, Cuba launched Operation Carlota on the 5th of November 1975. Fidel Castro sent large numbers of Cuban troops to reinforce the MPLA and stem the South African advance. By November 10, Cuba had flown in 2,000 to 3,000 combat troops. By the end of November, that number had surged to 10,000. At the end of December, an impressive 36,000 Cuban troops had arrived in Angola, offering much-needed support to their MPLA allies. With each new Cuban soldier landing in Angola, the South Africans faced ever-stiffening resistance. It was soon clear to them that they would not take Luanda by the 11th of November. Despite this, the South Africans pressed on. More and more Cuban troops continued to flood Angola, strengthening the MPLA's defensive lines and making it even more difficult for the South Africans to advance. Despite pouring in more South African troops, by mid-November 1975, the South African and UNITA advance had effectively been stopped. The South Africans were now facing growing international pressure for them to withdraw from Angola. The United States, previously their ally, distanced itself from the South Africans. Isolated internationally, the apartheid government had no option but to withdraw from Angola. By May 1976, the last South African troops had left Angola. The war with UNITA would continue for almost 3 more agonizing decades afterwards. But for now, the first round had been won by the MPLA. The MPLA had moved from being just another faction in some colonial war in Africa to being the legitimate government of Angola. The battle for Luanda didn't just decide who ruled Angola, it determined the course of the country for decades. With Cuban and Soviet support, the MPLA secured power, leading Angola down a socialist path for much of its modern history. If the FNLA or UNITA had won, the country's trajectory might have been completely different. Well, that's it for today. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with others, and subscribe for more in-depth explorations. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of this story surprised you the most? And if you want to dive deeper into more pieces like this, be sure to check out our other videos. Your engagement helps us bring more meaningful content to you. Thanks for watching.